You know, anyone over 80 was old in this particular paper, which I really, that's the kind of thing that we call ageisms, like talking about old geezers and that sort of thing. So anyway, I hope we can find better ways of describing aging, like senior adults, I guess. Senior adults, okay. So let me just start out by just reading, because I can't remember poems anymore. T.S. Eliot was a Christian, wonderful writer and poet, and most of you have heard of him. T.S. Eliot was a high church Anglican, high church Christian, and kind of an anti-modernist. Sorry. And short way of turning. Anyway, I'd just like to read you just a stanza of T.S. Eliot, because I think it relates very much to what I'm going to talk about and what we'll discuss. It's from his quartets, Vortex of Poetry, and I picked this up. Old people ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. Into another intensity, okay? For further union, a deeper communion through the dark, cold, and empty desolation of life. In my end is my beginning, okay? So really the whole principle of the philosophy of aging is this. When Eliot says, my end is my beginning, I think he meant two things. I think he meant both in terms of his Christian faith, in terms of a resurrection, an afterlife, but he also meant the beginning of the end of a phase of life where you can embrace it and enjoy it, and other people can enjoy you in that different phase of life. So that's really about what we're talking about today, and is this phase of life, this later phase of life, where we have to find a way to embrace it, and not only we, but society does as well. So philosophy of aging has really, in a nutshell, been addressing and embracing older people and the latter stages of life in a way that people develop, people continue to grow, continue to participate in society, but also recognize that they have some limitations. And usually these are, we know what they are. When I shake hands with Roger in the piece, and Roger almost breaks my hand. I say, sorry, Roger. I know that my grip is not as good as it used to be, and I have to live with that. So I have to look at golf scores go up, and not rowing as well. The things that I used to do, I certainly don't do as well, or I don't do them at all. Okay? But Roger's shaking of my hand is a reminder of my shortcomings. I think, and Roger, your grip is terrific. I didn't notice that. We must be about the same age. So anyway, what I'd like to do is just go through the history of this philosophy of aging. And it's a long one, but it has huge gaps. And talk about some of the observations in terms of the conflict between the system out here, if you want to call it the system of aging, which is society, and our own, if you want to call it the life world, which is a term that philosopher Habermas used, a life world. In other words, we have our own internal world, and we have to keep it in tension with forces on the outside that may limit our freedom, okay? And one of the things that limits us is a so-called chronometric perspective on aging where at say 80 years old or 70 years old, we're associated with certain characteristics. Oh yeah, he's 75, she's 80 years old. I guess can't participate in this, can't do this. Well, we really know that we're all very different. And chronometric aging is not the way to look at things. The way to look at things is, how are we right now? How are we? Should we be limited by age? We're limited by age in the system, by Social Security, doctor's appointments, being here, being there, by the clock, okay? So I think one of the principles of philosophy of aging is really to draw back from that and live your internal life in such a way that you don't get limited by this, by the system, okay? By the system of time on the outside. So I'm going to start off with the history and comment on the way through so that by the time we're finished, I hope you really get a pretty good picture of philosophy of aging. And when you leave, you may say to yourself, common sense, that's what's new. So, and I think there is a sense, will be a sense of that, okay? But most of the research is directed in this area on a few real important principles of a philosophy of aging. And so we'll get into those. Okay. Do this. I think I can. Okay. So we'll go through a few of the Greeks. Okay. And this is just a few things we'll talk about. The concept of life in stages and transitions. The ideas from the ancient philosophers. We talk about authenticity, and don't try to read this. These are slides that I made to really carry information and to hand out. So if you can get a little bit out of it, I'll talk about the slides. I'll try to summarize them. So individual philosophies of living as an adult, an individual adult is really what we're trying to reach for. So really Homer, which we don't, we're familiar with Homer, most of us. Homer, long time ago, he was the earliest reference that I could find of any coherence in terms of aging. And Homer, as you can see, had a sense of stages. He said, the child, the adult, middle life, old age. And he had a certain conception of where, certainly knew how long people lived. The average age in ancient Greece was 27 for men and just about not much longer for women. Although here he has 60 years of age. Men should not be in war. They should be at home teaching or teaching music. And women's age after 45 years, the end of their childbearing period, they were really, life for women was really kind of, in people's mind anyway, over. So Homer had a good sense of that. He talks about what people thought of aging, how we looked at people who were old. He says the tweeping such men, the voices of Trojan elders, delicate voices, shrill. So there was a concept of very old people being very feeble. But Homer saw beyond that and really saw that there's a way that one can reach wisdom, one can reach a period of reflection, period of activities that really were useful. And so he pictured old men and not women, because nobody, for some reason in the Greek, well, we can say the reasons, but the women were neglected substantially. Homer suggested that when men get older, they teach music, they help, they provide wisdom to the younger people. Okay, and that was the time when wisdom there was a constant revolution of activities and things that happened, tropes, from year to year to year that were easy to talk about. How to fight, how to use a sword, how to read Greek, and also to be able to teach the virtues, courage, strength, friendliness. Okay, so these are the things that in the time of Homer and the ancient Greeks, they had something to teach the younger people. Today, really, technology moves so fast that it's very, very difficult for us older folks to teach the young folks lots of things that are very important to them. For example, like computers. It's hello, to grandson Ben. Hello, Ben. Could you come over? I'm having this problem with this computer. Ben says, okay, Grandpa, but don't touch anything. Okay. So in the technical age where we are, the rate of change fast, the young really get past this in lots of ways. Okay, so really what we can teach is the virtues, friendliness, courtesy, how to deal with difficult situations. These are the, constant kind of evolutionary things that happen in life where we can still provide counsel. And that is how to live life, how to deal with other people. So there's still a way that with wisdom, and this was in the wisdom tradition that develops through the Greeks, is there are still some things that we can teach. Okay. The other thing I just mentioned about Homer quickly, I think you're familiar with the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer, in his mythology of the Odyssey, based on the Trojan War, Odysseus, who left Ithaca, went off to fight, and then went back to Ithaca, is really a kind of a metaphor for life. And it's one of the best ones, I think, in literature, is this going out into the world, getting knocked around, and coming back home, and living out your life in a constructive way. And of course, Odysseus had a chance for eternal life, which he turned down so he could go home. So Homer had a sense really of the total cycle of life. Okay, I'm trying to move a little faster here. I get okay. Anyway, what the key thing to point out here, this is our friend Solon. Solon was a wise lawmaker, actually developed the foundation for democracy, a Greek. And Solon developed a system of dividing up life called hebdomads. In 7-year stretches, Solon depicted life. And some, he said, well, when you're this way, you appear different. In other ways, you're sort of ready to do things like generate a family. And you become more sensible as you get older, etc. And then finally, in last year, which he was 63, which was an old man for Solon, Solon suggested that then we can emphasize and consider the value of a long life. But we do have to accept death, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should not be afraid of it. And this was, of course, a pre-Christian thinking. But so Solon was very prescient in a way, in able to determine these stages of life. And we find that really it gets better because this is Plato. Okay, Plato developed a wisdom tradition. And as you get older, you reflect, you think about your life, you teach the young, and you help out. But at the same time, you put behind your days as a warrior or as a statesman. Those are past. You got all the kudos that you're going to get So try to put these behind you and start a new phase of your life in this senior part of your life. He was noticed that wine played a critical role in this. The young should be forbidden to drink for 30 years when we get older, because wine is really good for older folks. And, medicine against the crabbiness of old age. So he was a man thinking of life. He was thinking of reality. But at the crux of his teaching was that in your senior years, you really have got to find a way to maybe withdraw a little bit from the world and start to reflect on your life and what it means, and be authentic as you can as a person. Oh, okay, so we'll move along quickly through the Aristotle, just quickly. Aristotle was really the first scientist in many respects. And Aristotle was interested in the physical changes in aging rather than what would make aging be a better situation in life. And as you can see, almost everything that Aristotle depicts here is sort of negative. He suspects that we got the yes, okay. So let me try to read it out. I go too long there. The pity of all people, okay, is not compassion. It's a plea, it's a feeling arising from weakness. Older people do not laugh very much. Older people can no longer be persuaded to take an interest in important matters. Okay, so in a way, a similar perspective to some of the earlier perspectives of the Greek is that if the older people can talk about their ailments, drink a little wine, stay out of the way of the younger people, you know, that's maybe the way Aristotle thought aging went. And he really didn't change his mind very much as life went on. He was at the end quite generally positive about the ability and the need for people to be reflective as they got older, and to accept death and their health and try to adapt to that situation. Okay, Epicurus got a bad rap, mostly because of the Epicurean philosophy ran up against Christianity, and it was basically Stoic. And it was broadly accepted and it was spreading. But the Epicureans got a reputation as being hedonists and let me say, drinking and women and wine. But the Epicureans really were Stoics, and they believed that the thinking of the direction of thinking should be toward the virtues, okay? Not toward pleasure. Maybe the pleasure would come from practicing the virtues. Certainly pleasure was important, but it wasn't, let me say, excessive sex or any of those things. So the Epicureans got a bad rap. And one of the best things that I would recommend to you reading is a book called Travels with Epicurus by David Klein, who's a writer and philosopher, and also kind of a comic. And it's a little book about how one discovers what it's like to be older. And David Klein talks about his trip to Greece and traveling and learning from people about relationships and friendships, and how you really have to put the other stages of your life behind you in order to function and fully enjoy and embrace old age. But I shouldn't say old age, I want to use that word. The older, one of the later phases of your life. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Also, not to fear death. Okay, and of course, the Stoics generally had an idea that gods were there, but you know, if they behaved themselves and stayed out of the way, kept their heads down, it would be okay. So the gods were not a concern, and the Stoics really didn't worry too much about the afterlife. So it's still a very good lesson. And okay, so Cicero. Just quickly, Cicero really wrote the most comprehensive story about aging and how to age in the person of this former warrior and statesman Cato. And his letters to Cato, called the Senectute, which is the essays on aging, and from that comes the expression senesis, which is terrible. It sounds like a skin disease. But the Senectute, so the Senectute was a profound and totally comprehensive story about how one ages and goes through the transitions from an earlier life to a later reflective life, a later life where wisdom is important, and you try to exercise and help the younger people with wisdom and others. You participate as a helper, but you put your former life behind you and think of this new phase you're in as unique and embrace it. Okay, so so Cicero wrote a wonderful, and by the way, very readable and maybe a few hundred words, but available on, for example, on the internet. Excellent depiction of how to grow older and how to live in a later stage of life. Okay, so Seneca. We can, I think, finish with Seneca. Seneca was a statesman and a writer, thinker, primarily a statesman. And Seneca, similar to Cicero, wrote letters on aging. When he got to be, a certain age, he started to think about aging. He took a visit to his estate. He discovered that everything on his estate was starting to run down. So he challenged the foreman of the estate. What's happening here? This is going. And my servant, how did you get this old servant here? Well, the old servant was a young man when Seneca hired him. And Seneca didn't recognize it. And he then recognized, however, that the estate was getting older and getting run down, and so was he. So he started to write on aging, and Seneca wrote letters on aging, and in very similar way to Cicero did, depicting the way to live a life as an authentic person, but grow beyond the earlier stages of life and live in a very, very, let me say, constructive way as an older person. Now, neither Seneca or Cicero had the chance to live into very old age, because Cicero was assassinated by Mark Antony and his body cut up into pieces, I think. And Seneca was directed by Nero to commit suicide. So these both writing excellent, comprehensive way about aging, but their lives were cut short because it was it was a rough period of time in early Greece and early Rome. So I think we can go. Okay, I'll get back to that in a minute. What I discovered in doing research, I had hoped to spend a lot of time in the stages between the Greeks and the present time. In other words, the age of faith, the Christian period. Okay. So surprisingly, I had a tremendous difficulty in finding something comprehensive written on aging and encouraging a constructive life as an aged person, as an older person, in all through the Middle Ages, okay, up into the Renaissance, beyond the Renaissance. Like the pickings were really thin, lots of comments on older people. And of course, why suddenly from the Greeks, why this should happen? Is that my phone?
No, it's a dog.
My phone is a dog too. Okay, so after Seneca and after Cicero, when was the next comprehensive study done on aging? The problems of aging, the problem with the system, the problems with retired people not being able to find something to do to replace their work when they were working full time. Well, what do they do now? They're retired, they got a pension, and maybe a few years later, they pass away. So the next comprehensive study on aging was 2,000 years after the Greeks. I mean, that sounds crazy, right? But that's the truth. 2,000 years after the Greeks, Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, has anyone heard of Simone de Beauvoir? She wrote the Feminine Mystique, the Second Sex, and wrote a book on aging. Okay. And she wrote it in France. It was published in 1952. As you remember, you may remember that Simone de Beauvoir was Jean-Paul Sartre's mistress. Okay, and she used to teach in a very bright woman. Used to teach in the Sorbonne, and she got started on aging when she overheard one of her pupils say, "Do you have that old woman?" Simone de Beauvoir, Professor Dubois, and she overheard this and she said, "What do you mean, old woman?" She started writing on aging. And in her writings, you're gonna excuse me standing in front of you, that's dark. But in her writings, she really counseled an acceptance of aging. And this is really the nutshell of the philosophy of aging. The only solution for the individual in France is to pursue and give life, for anyone to just give life meaning, is to find something else to replace what they were doing before, which was a serious problem. She says some passions must be sustained in order to prevent us from turning in on ourselves. Class and influence had much to do with whether people did well after retirement, and usually the better off they were, maybe the more educated they were. Generally, they certainly did better and lived longer. In the Middle Ages, one interesting point is that the longest living people seem to be the clergy. And think about it, I mean, they were educated, maybe they had a better situation in terms of resources and food and everything, but generally the clergy lived longer than other people, but all from the time of the Greeks to 1950s, okay? Generally, the attitude of the church, okay, was certainly as you get older to be more spiritual, certainly to be reflective. But what you're thinking of and what you're concerned about is saving your soul. Okay? This is the drive. Saving your soul was a community of Christ In the Middle Ages, huge community of Christ in the West. And there was a certain consolation in that feeling of that common belief. But basically the counseling was prepare yourself for death and prepare yourself for a couple of options in the afterlife, lean into the more positive one. So it makes sense that all through this period, for 2,000 years, I mean, there's a few exceptions, but not many, the church's emphasis was on preparing for death and anticipating for death and preparing for the resurrection and preparing for the resolution of your soul for your salvation. So that was the direction that this great span of time took. And it was only in 1903, 1900 that the science of gerontology was developed. And the science of gerontology was just studying aging, studying older people. And of course, the earlier studies that took place were on health. Why is the lifespan so short? What should we do with all these people? Where will we put them? How do we care for them? And of course, now the demographic of older people is huge. It's like 30% of the total population. And so 30% of the population, that means a couple of opportunities there, right? One is a market. That's a big market for these older chaps like us. And so Simone de Beauvoir recognized the difficulty of aging people. And society has to go a long way to get more positively directed toward improving the culture for aging people. So that really is the crux of the drive behind the philosophy of aging. How does one find those components that give people a satisfying life? How can you set the mind in such a way that when you're an older person, you've been through life, you have a successful or unsuccessful life, if you will, financially or whatever, that you can set a new course. And also, as people get older, how do you care for them? How can you encourage that kind of thinking? How can you encourage people that in a positive way to embrace that latter stage of life? And that's really the other side of philosophy of aging. And it's what occupies gerontologists mostly, is how to improve the environment for aging. How do you improve it in terms of lifespan? How do you improve it in terms of stimulation? How do you improve it in terms of occupation of older people? So the culture is starting to shift toward in a direction of encouragement of a life and a beginning for older people and their latter stages of life. And these when we say shifts, and the idea of different stages in life are reflected in modern psychology. And most of you, this is Carl Jung also divided up a lot of things, but he divided up life or slow life in stages. And in the latter stage of life, he saw reflection, withdrawal in terms of thinking, an active life, but basically one that becomes more reflective and more accepting both of the physical properties that people lose, but also more accepting in terms of death, because all of us are subject to that final going home, and whether going home you think of in a spiritual or religious way is one thing, and of course there are other ways to think about it, and but this acceptance of that stage and finality is very important. So Jung, if you'll notice, took from the Greeks. So the stages of life really that whole aspect of dividing life up into different stages started with the Greeks and then with Cicero and Seneca with the Romans. And this stopped at just, as the Christian community developed and didn't pick up again until, let me say, 1950. And that sounds crazy, I know, but that's the truth. Here's Erickson, the same thing. I won't go through Erickson, but basically a division of life into different stages, and later wisdom, dependency on other people, maybe, but again, a reflective period of finding yourself, finding your authentic self, not the persona that you lived with, maybe got through your working period in business or medicine or wherever you were, but maybe now there's a way to become more yourself without the pressures of the system out here to control you. So I'll just mention one other guy. Gene Cohen is another very modern psychiatrist who developed the same kind of, let's say, stages, suggesting that the senior part of your life is really a renaissance. It's really a period of new life, of you have to live with your shortcomings, your physical shortcomings. Sometimes you become ill, but even through pathology and illness, this acceptance, this drive to still be active is important. Again, I should say that, and you realize that my discussion of this whole area is from about 30,000 feet. But we have a short time, so I'm trying to depict kind of the nubbins of this this idea. I get excuse me again, folks, backing up. This slide really there's a certain distaste for older people. We're in a youth culture. And as was Rome and Greece, in a youth culture. They thought all the Greeks were young. Well, in a way they were, because they died at 27 to 30 years old. But there's still the aged in a traditional ways are thought of in a different way. And I think the drive toward this philosophy of aging is to think of is to blend the idea of older people into the same species as younger people, and just simply accept whatever shortcomings they have, but still they're active and vital members of society. We are, and we have to develop our own authenticity in order to make sure that we don't get squeezed by the outside pressures of society. Youth culture, yeah, we have a youth culture, and the best example of youth culture is the fact that we all belong to AARP, right? I mean, at some point, it seems like at 50 years old, you get a thing from AARP. It says you're old now. So AARP at 50, all right? So what's happened as in our generation is that the age of oldness, of aging, is gotten lower and lower. For example, somebody who's 40 years old, who's who's working in a corporation, one of the senior people, let's get some younger people in here. 40 years old, that's in a relative sense old in terms of corporate life. So, and exceptions to this, but of course, this idea of the youth culture has tremendous amount of pressure on all of us. So a philosophy of aging is not, and maybe this is the most important point, to get younger. Why would you want to get younger? Well, of course you would. You want to feel good, you want to look good. But the idea of trying to move from the latter stage of life back is what Erickson would say, Jung would say, and the Greeks would say is futile. And it's not only futile, but it limits your capacity to be unique and authentic in this latter stage of life. And if an example of this, when I started doing research on aging, and I just started out in Google, what did I come across first? Skin treatments. How do you stay younger? How do you look better? How do you find a way to, be like all the other folks who, are running and jumping and, enjoying the outdoors? You treat yourself in lots of ways by these products. So I found in philosophy, in this idea of philosophy of aging, enormous amount of commercial stuff. And you will find it if you look up you go to Google Scholar or you go to other websites, you start to get away from that. But that huge market that we have become because of our demographic is very, very rich, and people are really working that market very hard. So it's important. One of the principles is not, of all of the aging studies that I've seen, all of the literature, is basically not to fall back into some idea of a younger person and try to develop those characteristics. I mean, I'm thinking of terrible things like mini skirts at 85 years old or something like that. But the idea of becoming younger is something that is, I think, in society, there are enough people resisting that now, saying, look, I'm an older person, I'm in a stage of life that I'm enjoying, I'm happy, I may have a few health problems, but I'm where I am. I don't need to be a young chick anymore. I can be myself. And this is this drive really is where the philosophy of aging is going. And people are talking about relationships, what makes people happy as they go on in years, and what becomes essential. Relationships, certainly. Friendships. The Greeks thought the most important things was friendship. And of course, friendship is friendliness is a virtue. Okay, it's a virtue. Let me just kind of finally wrap up or stop with this fellow Jan Bars. I found that most of the work that was constructed in aging studies was done by the Dutch, and Jan Bars is sort of a leader in that movement in Holland and worldwide. Okay, also, basically, he's written books that, if you put them all together, they sort of are the art of aging. All right, and he draws very, very heavily on the Greeks. Very heavily on the Greeks. Most of his writing is talking about the Greeks. But let me back up again. I'm sorry for this. I think we'll read it here. Okay. So today's world, philosophy of aging, we need to embrace it. There's been an overall loss of respect for aging. I think that's true through the years. Dealing with aging people becomes a process focused on the decline. Okay, this is what people think of as older people. So, what next? He's going or she's going downhill. So, what one of Barr's most important principles is not fall back, into your earlier stage, but try to, same as Erickson, same as Jung, get comfortable where you are, write a narrative on your life, try to depict yourself in a way that really is authentic, and forget about this chronometric stuff. Forget about the measurement of age by numbers. So he was Barnes was the guy that really promoted that idea. And and finally it says here, a better understanding of the different times of life is needed by individuals and society. So I don't know how that can happen, but there is a drive behind this philosophy of aging and gerontology to try to suggest that older people are embracing a new beginning. And I think this is very positive, and of course, and not falling back into some other, wishful idea of being younger, doing the same things, doing similar things. In other words, it isn't a fight against youth. And so anyway, this is the crux of the philosophy of aging, again, from 30,000 feet. Let me say a word about the spiritual side, okay? Misty, and I told Misty this is more her department. Where is she going? Oh, hi. Okay. Richard Rohr is a very popular Franciscan priest, very popular guy in terms of he runs an institute for developing of reflection and spirituality and aging, and I think Misty's going to have we're going to review a book, aren't you?
It's one of the choices.
Yeah.
That the 12 people have voted on.
Yeah, but I think, to me, Richard Rohr represents many perspectives on aging that are somewhat positive, but I think his his perception is very good. There's a Christian orientation, but he also takes from the Greeks and takes from the Asians. And look at his major stages of life: the student, the householder, okay, the forest dweller, and the wise and enlightened person. And this is really an Asian concept, a Buddhist concept or a Taoist concept of men raising a family, being, doing their business, then withdrawing and developing spirituality, their minds, and then coming back and counseling people. Okay, so this idea is the same for not only the Asian model, but it's the same for Jung, it's the same for Erickson, it's the same for the Greeks, and it's the same for the philosophy of aging. And there's a handout that I gave you that really suggests aspects of psychology, of philosophy of aging that you can think about and consider, but they're all from literature and studies on those aspects that make aging a pleasant and wonderful experience. And the last thing I'll say, it's kind of a downer, but there are a number of studies done on how important spirituality is for older people and for people who are ready to pass away. And the largest study was a Harvard study, which was done 5 years ago, almost 10 years ago now. That big study, and it was done in Boston with some people who were both very educated and also people who were more middle class and not so educated. But basically, the sense was that in later years, spirituality most of the time becomes important. And I think sometimes that the definition of spirituality becomes a little narrow. because I think people do take a transcendent look at life. And from what I can learn from my research, and the idea that some people are Christians or religious and are thinking of the same thing that the people in the Middle Ages thought about salvation and an afterlife. I mean, this is happening today, but there are also people who are sort of material naturalists, if you will, or people who are scientifically oriented, who believe that the whole world is in a physical sort of model, and they think of themselves as maybe being part of nature, part of eternity, there are other ways to think of gain strength from spirituality, and that's what these studies found. The last study I read of many was a study done on people who are past in their the last stages, and the many interviews. And this was also a study at Harvard Divinity School, and the consensus of that was that these people, spirituality, religion was very important, and gave them strength, gave them confidence and hope. So in terms of spirituality, I'll just say that Richard Ward is a good path to follow, and it's I think there are other paths that are very similar, but the idea of reflection, a different life, breaking up from the earliest stages of life, and living a more reflective and authentic life is really the key. So.
Can we give it out again? I would like to open this to questions and comments. We only have one mic, so if you could come up to the mic.
You can take it off.
Then we'll be running around like in full authenticity, I am not 39, as Joseph said earlier. Would anyone like to come up to the mic with a question or comment?
Oh, we can hear you from.
Or you can shout. Here, Joseph.
Thank you very much, and you've done a good job of demonstrating that somebody who's arguably in the second half of their lifespan can still bring it in a couple of questions. A couple of things I thought of during your talk. One of them, when you mentioned about the sort of dearth of thoughtful stuff put out by the history of Christianity. I remember when I was in the monastery, one of the brothers saying that it's not for no reason that there are so many litanies for a good death. And I thought of that as you were speaking it. So it's like people who may have had interest or energy or skill to perhaps develop a theology of aging or a philosophy of aging. Instead, they aimed it towards creating litanies for a good death. And who knows why, but it probably has something to do with it. This world doesn't matter. The next world is more important, and put your focus there. But so I thought of that. One thing too, that my first thing that made me feel like society was looking at me as older, it actually happened before getting that thing in the mail from AARP when I turned 50. I was probably about 42 or 43. I went to my alma mater, Grinnell College, to help lead a summer ministry retreat program for the Diocese of Iowa. I went to a coffee shop to get a coffee, and the person gave it to me for what seemed like too little money. And I said, "I'm sorry, but I think you undercharged me." And she said, "Oh no, that's with your senior discount."
One thing that just to give those people hope to think that nothing happened during the Age of Faith. Augustine of Hippo, right, was an early thinker, early Middle Ages. Augustine really had a very constructive attitude toward aging. Also, he thought a little bit in stages, but again, he thought of later life as a contemplative period, a reflective period, but also with the primary idea of drawing closer to Christ, and it was the idea of preparation and anticipation of life going on. But Augustine of Hippo was one of the few books that really were saying very much during that period.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
George?
Good, sir.
Just a comment back on the slide on Plato.
Yes,
Plato visioned women being equal to men. It seems like
Yes,
it took a while to catch on.
yes, at the rate I was going, Joy, I think I skipped over that. Thank you.
Still hasn't caught on in time yet.
But I think it's come a long way,
First woman rector at Grace.
It's an example. That's right. That's right. So will it be a woman as Pope next? I don't know.
Anyone else? There's probably time for one more question.
Thanks for coming.
Anyone else? Greg, shout it out.
Oh, Ed, did you come across any information on, when growing older, we have to deal with more loss?
Yes, I think, certainly, there are some aspects that I sort of skimmed over, but, yeah, loss, both physical capabilities, as I think I mentioned that, but just loss of relatives, friends,
Right.
people that are close to you, and of course that generates the other problem, and that's one of loneliness. And one of loneliness at that period of our lives can be something that it can be dominant. I mean, it can really be a problem, and hence contribute to depression. So the idea of companionship and support and friends are so important, and I think as we get older, we run thin with some of those things, So it's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. I skipped over it.
If I can jump in.
Yeah. Thanks.
On that note of loneliness, Grace DeBoer and Gail Donahue Pepin have started a new ministry, a lookout ministry, where we look out for one another from the verse in Philippians. So if you'd like to be part of that ministry, let Julia know, or contact Grace or Gail directly. The two books that are on the docket for you to vote on the survey that's on the weekly email. One is a book by Richard Rohr on the 12 steps. And the 12 steps aren't just for recovery from addiction. They're for learning the spiritual skills of daily living, no matter what your faith. And the other book is a Buddhist book called The Spirituality of Aging. So if you want to take a look at that survey and see which book interests you more. I am so pleased. I asked Ed to do this when I first got here a year and a half ago. I'm so pleased that we finally got to it, and thank you for sharing the wisdom of old age, my friend. Pasha.
Can I just say, I work with old people. I love my stories that I gather from them. When I was a little girl, though, I memorized this poem, and it's very short, so please indulge me. I don't know who wrote this poem, but it doesn't matter. It's for all of us. Age is a quality of mind. If you have left your dreams behind, if you no longer look ahead, if your ambitions' fires are dead, then you are old. But if from life you take the best, and if in life you keep the jest, if love you hold, no matter how the years go by, no matter how the birthdays fly, you are not old.
Thank you. If you're joining us for the first time and you'd like to be in on other forums we do on faith and science and social issues, there's a sign-up sheet for your email in the back, or follow us on Facebook. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. By the way, I just say Nancy Kinner was responsible for winning this monster.